temples burned easily. That was the first lesson many monks learned when war came to the mountains. The second was that no one cared if you were peaceful. Arrows didn't ask questions. Fire didn't hesitate. Monks might have renounced the world, but the world hadn't returned the favor. The robes, the silence, the prayers. None of it mattered to men with blades and empty stomachs. Before we go further, take a moment to settle in. Dim the lights. Let the noise of the day fade into the background. And if you enjoy these quiet reflections on forgotten lives, consider subscribing. No pressure. Only if it feels right. Maybe leave a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see where in the world these stories find their home. In feudal Japan, war was always moving. Armies drifted across the land like storms, and wherever they passed, they took what they wanted: food, shelter, metal, labor, silence. Temples, with their stores of rice, iron tools, and sometimes even hidden silver, were magnets. Even without wealth, they had roofs and walls, and that was enough. The mere shape of a temple was a threat to some and a prize to others. Monks lived by schedules: wake at dawn, chant sutras, sweep the grounds, cook rice, copy scripture, meditate, sleep. Each task flowed into the next, calm and deliberate. The daily rhythm was supposed to bring clarity, peace, humility. But war didn't respect schedules. One day might start with zazen and end with blood on the floor. You could chant all morning and be staring down a spear by nightfall. Some temples tried to pay their way out of trouble. Others offered prayers. Neither worked. Soldiers took what they wanted. If the monks resisted, they were cut down. If they submitted, they were accused of collaboration. There was no safe choice. Only survival. Temples that once offered shelter and wisdom turned into places of suspicion. Burn it. Loot it. Strip the gold from the altar. Use the wood for fire. Many monks fled. Some hid among peasants or retreated deep into the mountains, carrying nothing but a bowl and a prayer. They lived in caves, under trees, or not at all. Others stayed, believing the temple must be protected, that the practice must continue. These were the ones who watched their statues shattered, their scriptures burned, their gardens trampled. They buried sacred texts in jars beneath the floorboards. They disguised relics as rubble. They held ceremonies in whispers. Sometimes soldiers would demand sake and be offered tea. They would demand gold and find only rice. They would demand loyalty and find silence. That silence was often mistaken for defiance and punished. Still, the monks swept the floors. Still, they bowed. Still, they chanted. Because even if the world was collapsing, the breath went on. And if you could return to the breath, you hadn't lost everything. Not yet. The world might burn, but one inhale and one exhale at a time, the monks stayed rooted in something older than the flames. Not because they were fearless, but because they had nothing left to lose, except the practice. And to them, that was everything. The silence inside a monastery was different during war. It wasn't the peace of meditation. It was the silence of hiding, thick, breath held, stretched thin across long corridors like an old sheet pulled too tight. Monks who had once used silence as a spiritual tool now used it for survival. It was a silence filled with tension, with listening, with waiting for the sound of boots. Footsteps were softer. Voices dropped to whispers. Doors were closed and never slammed. The bell that once marked time and ritual was wrapped in cloth and rung with a bare hand, if it was rung at all. No echoes, no signals, just the bare minimum to keep the rhythm of the day alive without drawing attention. Schedules still existed, but they were loose and cautious. Meals depended on what hadn't been stolen. Meditation sessions were interrupted by distant screams or the smell of smoke. Chants were shortened to fragments, muttered rather than sung. Sutras were memorized and then burned just in case. Paper was too valuable to risk leaving behind. The air in the meditation hall was thick with incense and fear. Every ritual became both a practice and a cover, something that could be dropped mid-action if the alarm was raised. Temples tried to look poor. Paintings were taken down. Altars were stripped. Anything gilded was buried or hidden behind false walls. Broken bowls were kept on display to suggest scarcity. They let weeds grow in the gardens. They smeared ash on the outer statues to make them look neglected, unloved. The goal was to look empty, insignificant, like there was nothing here worth taking, but there was always something worth taking. Dry storage, old metal, young hands, clean water. The monks prepared, not for battle, but for vanishing. Scrolls were sealed in clay pots and hidden beneath floorboards. Statues were disassembled and buried in garden beds. Food was scattered between secret caches under tiles, behind loose stones. Escape paths were rehearsed, not discussed. No one talked about what would happen if the walls fell. Everyone already knew. Some had packs ready by the door. Some had memorized different mountain trails in case they had to run without warning. The temple dogs were trained not to bark. There were days when nothing happened. Just waiting. Just listening. The wind in the trees, the distant sound of hooves, a cough in the hallway. On those days, monks continued their rituals with extra care. Not because they had the strength, but because it gave them something to hold. A bowl to clean, a mantra to repeat, a floor to sweep. When there was nothing to control outside, they focused harder on the inside. When they couldn't protect the building, they protected the breath. Sometimes travelers arrived, hungry, injured, desperate. The monks fed them if they could, hid them if they dared, turned them away if they had no choice. Mercy had to be weighed against survival. Every act of kindness came with a risk, but still, they lit incense for the sick. They chanted for the dead. They shared hot water for washing when there wasn't enough tea. No one was unafraid, but they practiced anyway. They sat with trembling hands. They walked the corridors at night, listening to the distant cracking of wood in the forest and wondering if it was a tree falling or someone coming. They whispered chants as they hid in storage rooms. They prayed for time, because that was the vow. And war didn't cancel it. It only made it harder to keep, which, somehow, made it matter more. Silence was no longer sacred. It was strategy. The monks stopped using drums to signal mealtimes. No more bells to mark the hours. No more chanting loud enough to carry across the hills. Sound was a liability now. Too many had learned the hard way that noise invited company, and company rarely came with good intentions. Silence wasn't just about peace anymore, it was survival. Stillness wasn't just discipline, it was disguise. They adapted. Mealtimes were staggered, chants were whispered or mouthed in unison, breath sinking like wind in the trees. The rhythm of the temple didn't stop. It just quieted itself into near invisibility, like an animal hiding in the underbrush. Walking became softer. Doors were closed gently. Wooden sandals were left behind to avoid the slap of steps echoing through the halls. Even laughter, once common among the young novices, was absent, replaced by wary glances and clenched jaws. A few monks were assigned to watch duty, taking turns on the roof or from behind the wooden slats of the bell tower. They weren't trained to fight. They weren't armed. They just watched and memorized shapes. A farmer walks differently than a scout. A merchant's ox kicks up dust. A horseman's does not. They learned to read shadows, to interpret smoke in the distance, to smell danger before it arrived. Their reports were given in short nods or silent gestures. One finger raised meant strangers coming. 2 fingers meant armed. 3 meant run. Even the gardens were tended with caution. Vegetables grew between hedges now, shielded from passing eyes. Rows became staggered, nothing orderly, nothing to attract notice. The once proud temple courtyard, where pilgrims once gathered, was bare and swept clean to show there was nothing worth taking. Monks moved in pairs, rarely alone. They kept tools nearby, not for defense, but to appear occupied. Sometimes appearing poor was the only defense they had. One monk wore the same robe for 3 years, not out of humility, but to appear ragged and invisible. At night, the temple windows were shuttered tightly. No light escaped. Candles were shielded in clay pots or placed in corners where their flicker couldn't betray anyone. Evening meals were eaten in near darkness, in silence. Every sound felt like a crack in the armor of invisibility. Even snoring became something to suppress. But even in fear, the practice remained. They still woke before sunrise. They still sat, even if the floor was cold and their stomachs empty. They still recited the same verses they had memorized as boys, some of them now gray-haired, but still repeating the same syllables as they had every morning for decades. Their voices had softened, but not vanished. The cadence of their breath still shaped the mornings. They copied scriptures by firelight, huddled beneath worn blankets. They took turns gathering water at night, covering buckets with cloth to muffle the splash. When food was scarce, they foraged with care, always in pairs, never on paths. Sometimes they went days without speaking, but their silence was not empty. It held intention. It held memory. Not for the gods, not for protection, just to remember they were still monks, even now, especially now, because in a world where everything else had been taken, land, food, safety, sound, the one thing they still owned was their vow, and they protected it with silence. Winter made everything worse. The cold slipped through the temple walls and settled in the bones. Thin robes offered no protection. Blankets were few and thin. Fires were rationed down to embers. Even the ink froze if you left it uncovered. Monks wrapped their hands in cloth and kept writing, kept copying the sutras one brittle page at a time, hands trembling, breath fogging over worn parchment. They would huddle around a single lamp, squinting through frost, determined not to let the teachings vanish with the warmth. Snow made the roads impassable. No pilgrims came, no merchants passed, no news arrived. War didn't stop. It just got quieter, crueler. Raiding parties left fewer survivors. People disappeared in the snowdrifts. Sometimes monks found frozen bodies at the base of the temple steps. Strangers, peasants, sometimes children. They lit incense. They said nothing. Death became another visitor. They did not turn away. Food was a memory. The last of the rice was gone by mid-season. Meals turned into boiled roots, pine bark, dried moss, and whatever they could scavenge from the forest. When they were lucky, they found chestnuts, or trapped a squirrel. Most days there was nothing. Monks sat in meditation not because it was noble, but because it helped them forget the hunger. For an hour, maybe 2, they could feel like they were more than their stomachs. Meditation became not a path to enlightenment, but a tool for surviving emptiness. The practice didn't stop. It just slowed, like a river under ice. Chants were hoarse, bows were stiff. The temple bell cracked from the cold. They kept using it anyway. Its tone changed, duller, shorter, but it still rang. Just once, each morning, a small sound against the endless hush. Discipline became survival. Each ritual was a thread. Enough threads kept you from unraveling. Sweep the floor, even if it's just snow. Light the candle, even if it flickers out. Bow, even if your back aches. Breathe, even if the air cuts. They wrote messages in the snow with broom bristles. They carved lines of scripture into firewood before burning it. They preserved what little they could, even as the world shrank down to cold stone and silence. Some monks fell ill, coughs that never left, joints that refused to bend, sleep that came too easily and too often. When one of them died, they buried the body beneath the frost, said the prayers softly, and returned to their work. Grief was not expressed. It was absorbed, the way snow absorbs sound. And, in the silence of winter, something strange happened. They endured, not through strength, through repetition, through surrender, through the sheer act of not leaving, through the decision to remain when everything around them begged for escape. They stayed, because that's what the vow meant, even when no one was watching, even when there was nothing left to stay for but the next breath, even when their own breath was the only sound they could trust. And when spring came, if it came, they would be there, still seated, still breathing, still chanting, even if no one heard. By now, the silence had changed. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence after a scream, the kind that hangs in the air like smoke, thick and lingering. In the ruins of a monastery, after the soldiers had left, the quiet wasn't empty. It was swollen with memory. Footsteps echoed louder. The wind through broken windows sounded like voices that were no longer there. Even the birds had stopped singing, as if the earth itself had paused, waiting to see if anything was worth starting again. The absence of sound became a presence. It watched them. It sat with them at meals. It slept on the floors where others had died. Rebuilding wasn't an option. Not really. The monks who stayed behind did what they could, propped up half-burnt beams, stacked stones back into walls, gathered scorched fragments of sutras from the ash. They stitched torn robes with thread pulled from sleeping mats. They boiled water in cracked pots. They reused everything. Nothing was too broken to be of use. Even pain. Especially pain. The pain was proof they had survived, a sign that the body still worked. That time hadn't swallowed them whole. The altar, blackened by fire, still stood. Half the statue of the Buddha remained, its face melted smooth. But the monks still bowed to it, not because it looked holy anymore, but because it reminded them what devotion looked like under siege. Its damaged form was no less sacred. If anything, it was more so. Here was an image that had endured, just like them. There was comfort in that resilience, even when it looked nothing like the stories they'd once copied in gold ink. Some of them didn't speak for weeks. They communicated with nods, with gestures, with shared looks across rooms that used to be filled with chanting. A hand on a shoulder meant more than a sentence. A cup of tea, silently passed, could say everything that needed to be said. They kept the schedule, even when there were only 2 or 3 of them left. Morning chants, midday cleaning, evening meditation. It was all they had. The routine, stripped of ceremony, still held structure. It kept the mind from slipping. It gave shape to days that might otherwise dissolve into dread. The rains came early that year. Leaking roofs soaked the floors. Rats found the rice before the monks did. At night, the wind howled through the cracks in the walls like a beast circling something already wounded. Water ran down the walls in thin rivulets. Shoes were never dry. Firewood was always damp. But they lit candles anyway, even if they flickered out, even if they smoked instead of burned. They lit them because light was an answer to the dark, even if it only lasted a moment. Some nights the memories crept in, of screams, of fire, of monks who didn't make it. Dreams turned to smoke. Waking felt heavier than sleep. But they kept waking. They greeted each dawn with the same 3 bows, the same silent gratitude for breath. They shared what little they had. Half a bowl of rice, a torn page from a rescued sutra, a story passed down in whispers. Even laughter returned, thin and rare, like light through fog. Someone would say something small, absurd, a joke about tea that tasted like rainwater, and it would be enough to spark a smile. They learned to pray with less, with fewer words, with fewer voices. They prayed with their hands, with their breath, with the slow, careful movements of a day survived. They turned every act into an offering. Scrubbing a floor, repairing a robe, staring into the forest and watching the trees stay standing. But they stayed. They stayed because they had made vows. They stayed because someone had to remember. They stayed because silence, even broken, was still better than forgetting. They knew no help was coming, but they didn't wait for help. They just kept going. One bow, one breath, one step at a time, one candle lit, even in the rain, one word remembered, even when the voice failed, one moment of stillness held, even when the world refused to be still. And in that, there was something close to peace. No one talks about the cold, not the dramatic kind, the sudden snowfall or the frozen rivers, but the kind that seeps in through the floorboards and never leaves, the kind that settles in your bones and makes your breath visible even indoors. Monks in wartime didn't have thick coats or layered bedding. They had thin robes, shared fires, and discipline. When it was cold, they sat anyway. The temple halls were open to the wind. Paper walls couldn't keep out the chill. Nights were the worst. No fires were allowed after dark. Too visible. Light was dangerous. Heat was a luxury. So they slept in pairs, back to back for warmth, using spare robes as makeshift blankets. In the early hours, before the sun even considered rising, they rose, bowed, washed their faces with water so cold it burned, and then they sat. Sometimes they couldn't feel their toes. Sometimes their knees locked up. But they didn't shift. They didn't complain. The practice didn't change because the temperature did. If anything, it grew sharper. Every breath was visible. Every inhale reminded them they were still alive. Every exhale was a ghost disappearing into the gray air. Wood would crack in the cold. Ink froze in the pots, thickening like sap. Food took longer to cook, and sometimes it didn't cook at all. They chewed half-raw rice, grateful for the heat it gave off. They boiled roots, drank hot water as broth, and treated every warm swallow as sacred. They huddled in kitchens between chores, not speaking, just listening to the wind batter the walls. Even the birds stopped singing in that kind of weather. There were mornings where everything was white and still. The snow packed so high they had to dig paths just to get to the latrine. Work didn't stop. Snow was swept from the walkways daily, lest it harden into ice. Gardens had to be tended, even if nothing grew. Wood had to be chopped with fingers so cold they barely closed around the axe. Prayer scrolls had to be preserved, even if it meant copying them with cracked hands and trembling lines. The ink smudged. The brush slipped, but they kept writing. Frost formed inside the meditation hall, on the walls, on the sleeves of their robes. They would sit surrounded by it, breathing fog, unmoving. The wind howled against the rafters like a spirit looking for a body. They ignored it, or accepted it. Sometimes it was hard to tell the difference. Still, the monks swept snow from the walkways. Still, they chanted with chapped lips. Still, they bowed until their fingers went numb, because cold, like war, was not something they could control, but how they met it. That was theirs to decide. There was no comfort. But there was clarity. There was no escape. But there was endurance. And sometimes that was enough. Enough to survive another night. Enough to remember who they were. Enough to sit in stillness while the world cracked and groaned around them. No one joined the monastery expecting comfort, but no one expected this either. When the wars dragged on, everything inside the temple began to thin out. Supplies, energy, even faith. The rice stores that once lasted months were now measured in days. Monks grew used to hunger the way others grow used to noise. Always present, always pressing. The bellies stopped rumbling after a while. Emptiness just became another part of the robe. Bones showed, eyes hollowed, movements slowed not out of grace but because there was nothing left to burn inside the body. Their robes hung off their shoulders like empty sacks. The weight of existence itself grew heavier. In the mornings, they boiled tree bark, not because it tasted good. It didn't. But because it gave them something hot to sip while their fingers thawed. The cold crept into their joints, stiffened their spines during Zazian, and made it harder to bow without wobbling. Still, they bowed. When their knees cracked, they bowed. When their breath caught in the cold air, they bowed. The motion mattered more than the ease. Sometimes a monk collapsed mid-prostration, and no one rushed to lift him. They waited. When he could, he rose, and if he didn't, they chanted around him until he did, or until he didn't. Firewood became precious. Some nights there was none. They wrapped themselves in spare robes, if there were any, and huddled in corners. Sleep came slowly. Dreams came quicker. Half hallucinations of food or old memories of warmth. And yet they woke with the bell, even if the bell was a stone knocked against wood. In those hours before dawn, their breath formed clouds in the dark room. The cold made everything sharper, the sting of memory, the edge of discipline. Scrolls were no longer copied. Ink was gone. Paper had been used to seal broken windows or line sandals. The few sacred texts that remained were read only with the eyes, not the hands, fragile pages crumbling at the edges. Instead, the monks practiced by reciting what they had memorized. They took turns, one voice at a time. Sutras passed down mouth to mouth like lifelines. No one corrected mistakes anymore. The effort mattered more than the precision. It was the rhythm of survival. Their mouths moved, even when their voices failed. Words lived in silence now. When illness came, and it always came, it passed slowly. There were no doctors, no medicines, just damp rags and whispered chants. Sometimes the sick recovered. Sometimes they simply grew quieter until they stopped moving. They buried the dead behind the temple walls if the ground wasn't too frozen. If it was, they wrapped the body in cloth and sat beside it until the thaw. No one rushed grief. There wasn't energy to. Sometimes they chanted for days, not because they believed it would help, but because stopping felt worse. The loss was constant. A robe folded on a mat, a bowl left untouched, a quiet in the hall where a voice once chanted. But no one made speeches. No one held ceremonies. Mourning was woven into the day, a silent thread running through every bow, every sweep of the floor, every breath. Even laughter, rare as it was, came with the weight of remembering. They laughed to stay human, and then bowed to honor the ones who couldn't. And still, no one left. Not because they were trapped, because leaving meant something worse, breaking the vow. The practice was suffering. That was understood. They weren't there for comfort. They were there for presence, for stillness, for the breath that kept returning even when nothing else did. When even the breath came ragged, they watched it. When tears fell during meditation, they let them. This was the path, even now, especially now, when there was no reason to stay except the vow itself. And that was enough. It had to be. It was easy to forget how young some of them were. Not all monks were old men with gray robes and slow movements. Many were barely out of childhood, sent to the temples by poor families, born into monastic lineages, or orphaned by the same war that now threatened the temple walls. They didn't choose the robe. The robe was what was left. What remained after fire, after famine, after fathers didn't come back from the fields, and mothers stopped speaking. The robe wasn't protection. It was a surrender. A quiet agreement that the world had no other place for you. For them, the monastery was the only world they knew. stone paths, morning bells, rice bowls, and scripture. Their hands remembered the shape of a broom better than a sword. Their ears knew the rhythm of chanting better than shouting. And yet, they lived with the sound of war always nearby. Hoofbeats in the hills, shouting across rivers, the crack of bamboo spears, the crunch of fire-consuming roofs. They knew the difference between the snap of a branch and the sound of footsteps, between a traveling merchant and a scout, between distant thunder and a cannon. The dogs would bark differently depending on who was coming. Older monks tried to protect them. They assigned them safer chores, drawing water, grinding tea, sweeping inner courtyards, kept them inside when rumors came down the mountain, taught them to keep their heads low and their words few. But the young ones still saw too much. They saw the fear in their teachers' eyes when riders approached. They heard the silence that fell after distant screams. They helped sweep ash from burned prayer flags. They knew what it meant when a scroll was buried in a sealed pot beneath the garden stones. They watched as sacred statues were moved and disguised, their faces wrapped in cloth, as if blindfolding the divine could save it. Some of them helped lift the stones with hands not strong enough for the weight. They sat in meditation anyway, not because they understood it, but because it was what you did. You sat, you breathed, you stayed, even when your stomach growled, even when your hands trembled, even when your back ached from work and your eyes burned from smoke. Some sat with tears streaming down their cheeks, not making a sound. Some clenched their robes in fists too small to hold on to anything else. Some fell asleep mid-chant, exhausted by hunger, and were gently nudged back to the rhythm. They didn't know what enlightenment meant, but they knew how to sit through fear. Some ran, some stayed, some broke under the weight of silence. Others grew into it like roots growing around stone. Quiet, unyielding. The ones who stayed began to move differently, more slowly, more deliberately. They learned to listen beyond words. They learned to read the wind, to trust the sound of breath, to measure time not in hours but in heartbeats and repetitions. They could sense when someone was lying just by the tension in their silence. They understood that stillness was not passivity. It was strength trained to hold. They were taught that death wasn't to be feared, but it was still close enough to smell. Burnt rice, wet iron, smoke that clung to robes no matter how many times they were washed. Blood in the courtyard dust, the bitter tang of fear in the mouth. And through it all, they chanted. Sometimes their voices cracked. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they chanted while digging graves. Sometimes they chanted while watching the sky for smoke. No one told them to stop. That was the rule. You never stopped, even in darkness, even in cold, even with no promise that anyone was listening, even if you were the only one left alive, because even the youngest had learned. The body bends, the breath carries, the stillness holds, the ritual remains, the practice continues. Even when the world forgets you, even when you are the last one chanting, even when your voice is the only sound in the rubble. It didn't take much for a monk to disappear. A missed meal, an empty bedding mat, a bowl left unwashed. Sometimes they left on purpose, slipped into the forest before dawn, robes soaked with dew, hands wrapped around a single bundle, a spare robe, some dried rice, maybe a fragment of scripture tucked deep inside. Sometimes they returned weeks later, gaunt and silent, eyes distant, as if they'd seen too much or found something they couldn't explain. Sometimes they didn't return at all. Others vanished without warning, taken by patrols or bandits, pressed into forced labor, killed on suspicion alone. A monastery in wartime didn't have time for ceremony when one of its own went missing. There was no procession, no mourning bell, just a quiet space where someone used to sit. No farewell, no explanation, just absence. The others noticed. Of course they did. They bowed in that direction a little longer, swept that corner of the hall more carefully, left a portion of food where no one would eat it. But no one spoke of it. Words drew attention. Attention was dangerous. Even the act of wondering aloud where someone had gone could be heard by the wrong ears. Silence became self-protection. Some monks etched names into stones behind the main hall, small hidden memorials in the moss, visible only to those who knew to look. Others kept track silently, marking losses with extra prostrations during evening chants, folding sorrow into ritual like another layer of cloth. It wasn't about grief exactly. It was about continuity. Someone was gone. The breath went on. The sutras didn't change. They learned not to ask where people had gone. They learned to chant around absences. They learned to keep going with fewer and fewer voices. They learned that emptiness had its own presence. They practiced next to mats that hadn't been touched in days. They left offerings at doors that no longer opened. They lit incense not only for the dead, but for the missing, until, eventually, the silence itself became normal. The monastery grew quieter with each moon. Birds still sang. Wind still passed through the cracks in the wood. But inside, the human voice grew thin. Fewer conversations, fewer footsteps, more time spent in reflection, in waiting, in not knowing. The stillness wasn't peaceful anymore. It was hollow, stretched thin like old cloth. And when they sat in zazen, they didn't just listen for the breath. They listened for footsteps that never returned. They listened for laughter that once echoed through the cloister. They listened for names they would never say aloud again. And in that quiet, they bowed deeper. Not in mourning, but in memory. Some monks fought back. Not with swords, though a few picked up spears when there was no other option. But with something older, quieter, and harder to kill, memory. They became keepers of what war wanted to erase: names, stories, lineages, chants, instructions for rituals no one else remembered, practices that had no audience left. They wrote with makeshift ink, ashes mixed with water, soot scraped from burned wood. They etched prayers onto scraps of bark, walls of caves, the backs of broken roof tiles, and the inside of their own sleeves. When the flames came, they carried pieces of the temple on their backs, in their robes, in their heads. They memorized entire volumes of scripture, repeating lines silently to themselves as they walked. These monks wandered, not aimlessly, but deliberately, moving at night, avoiding main roads, resting in forests, sleeping beneath trees or in ruined shrines. They offered prayers in hushed voices, not to be heard, but to not forget. Some pretended to be peasants. Others pretended to be mad. A few were caught and interrogated, beaten, executed. A few vanished into the mountains and were never heard from again. But some survived long enough to pass on what they carried, not in grand gestures, but in crumbs. A verse scribbled on a rice paper scrap, a chant hummed during harvest, a mudra taught to a child who didn't even know its meaning yet, a folded cloth holding a relic no bigger than a coin, passed hand to hand, a chant whispered in a rice field, a ritual reconstructed from fragments, a bell pattern remembered by heart, a song of breathing disguised as lullaby, a step taken with intention when all other steps were chaos, a meal eaten in silence, its rhythm echoing a forgotten ritual, the way water was poured, the way a fire was lit. Each became an echo of something sacred. It wasn't resistance in the way soldiers knew it. There were no ambushes, no victories, no strategy. But it was a refusal all the same, a refusal to forget, a refusal to let the silence win, to keep speaking into a void, knowing it might never speak back, to say, "We were here, we remembered," because even if you lose the temple, Even if the scrolls turn to ash and the statues fall, as long as someone remembers how to kneel, how to breathe, how to recite the first line of the Heart Sutra, the temple is not completely gone. If the words live in a whisper, if the posture is held even once more, then the fire didn't finish its job. The memory is the altar. The breath is the incense. The silence is the chant. They didn't call themselves brave. They didn't call themselves anything. They shaved their heads, kept walking, avoided attention, carried the sacred in silence. They walked slowly, deliberately, with the gravity of monks who understood that what they carried wasn't paper or stone. It was survival, disguised as tradition. They walked through fields that had once been villages. They passed by burned halls where they had once chanted. They nodded to travelers, never explaining who they were. They helped the wounded without a word, buried the dead without judgment. They taught what they could, when they could, sometimes only with a look. They just kept walking, kept remembering, kept reciting, even if only in their thoughts. And in that, the practice survived, not loudly, not proudly, but faithfully. And that was enough, because faithfulness in times like that was everything. Nothing was built to last forever, not the roofs, not the scrolls, not the people. By the time the war had dragged on for years, most temples weren't recognizable anymore. The lucky ones were ruins, charred beams, cracked statues, moss covering what used to be sacred. The unlucky ones were occupied, turned into barracks, storage rooms, or holding pens for prisoners. The scent of incense was long gone, replaced by the stink of sweat, rot, and wet leather. What was once quiet and still now echoed with the heavy steps of soldiers and the sounds of barking orders. If you walked past these places, you might see the ghost of what used to be, the curve of a gate, a bell tower with no bell, prayer flags shredded into colorless rags, flapping weakly in the wind. Monks who survived this long had changed. They no longer resembled the serene portraits in old paintings. They were thinner, quieter. Their eyes didn't wander. Their steps were careful. They trusted nothing and no one, not because they had turned bitter, but because they had learned. A knock on the gate no longer meant a guest. A stranger on the road wasn't a fellow pilgrim. It was often someone desperate, violent, or both. Many no longer opened the gates at all, keeping them barred day and night. Some were the last of their temple. They stayed alone, keeping a skeleton version of the rituals alive. One bowl, one candle, one chant. Enough to mark the passing of a day, enough to prove that someone remembered how. Their temples had no congregation, no support, just wind, stone, and memory. They patched holes in the roof with reeds and bark. They kept fires small and smoke low. They avoided attention. They used ash and soot to make ink. They melted old wax stubs to fuel tiny lamps. Their chants echoed in empty halls, the sound swallowed by dust. The wooden statues they once prayed before had been blackened by fire or stolen outright. Still, they turned to the empty altars with bowed heads. Still, they recited the verses by heart, even if the pages had burned long ago. Their robes were patched with hemp and bark cloth. Winter came early in the mountains, and they wrapped themselves in anything they could find. Old straw mats, animal hides, layers of worn robes stitched together. Ink was scraped from burnt rice and animal fat. The old calligraphy brushes had long since fallen apart, replaced by whittled bamboo and rough bristles pulled from broken brooms. Still, they copied the sutras. Still, they bowed, even if no one else ever saw it, even if there was no one left to teach. The act of copying wasn't for preservation. It was a vow, a whisper into time, a stubborn insistence that the teachings had not yet been extinguished, because it wasn't for others. It was for the practice, to remind themselves that something could still be done with care, that not everything had to be broken. That quiet, wasn't the same as surrender. To remember what quiet used to mean. Before it was just the space between shellings. Before it was what came after screams. To feel, even for a moment, that silence could once again be sacred, even if no one came back, even if the temple never rose again, even if the war never ended, even if their names were forgotten and their robes decayed into the earth and no one ever heard the last of their chants. They stayed. And that, in itself, was the point. Because sometimes survival is an act of defiance, and devotion, even in ruins, is a kind of resistance. Because, in a world bent on burning, the quiet act of continuing is louder than any scream. Some monks didn't survive. Not the war, not the famine, not the cold. They vanished between seasons, one at a time. No battles, no glory, just absence. One morning a bowl went untouched. A pair of sandals stayed by the door. A blanket folded too neatly. That was all. There were no funerals, no elaborate chants or ceremonial cremations. Just a shallow grave near the edge of the forest or a wrapped body released into the river. Whatever the moment allowed. Whatever the silence could hold. Sometimes they didn't even find the body. Just the gap in routine. Just the missing footsteps. The ones who remained didn't talk about it. They just picked up the duties. A new hand swept the steps. A different voice lit the incense. A pair of hands folded the robes. It wasn't denial. It was devotion. If the dead had believed enough to stay, then the living owed them the continuation of the practice. The breath must go on. The sutras must be remembered. The rhythm must not be broken, no matter how many voices were lost. Still, the grief clung like smoke. Not loud, not always visible, but always there. It lingered in the corners of the prayer hall. It echoed in the bell tower, even when the bell no longer rang. It settled into the folds of robes, into the brittle edges of old pages. The grief became part of the landscape. The cold months were the worst. The snow fell deep, muffling everything. Wood was scarce. Meals shrank. Water had to be broken from ice. Ink froze in the pot. Fingers cracked. The mountains swallowed sound and light. Nights were long. Mornings came in shades of gray. And yet, through all of it, the monks kept the schedule, even if the sun never broke through the clouds. Even if the only warmth was from memory. Even if their voices shook while chanting. They wore extra layers, patched robes, old straw, anything to keep the wind from stealing too much of them. They huddled together to copy texts. They boiled roots for ink. They rationed candles, sitting in near darkness to preserve the flame. Yet the lines of the sutras remained straight. The bows were full. The offerings were placed with care. Devotion didn't fade. It became sharper. There was a strength in that. Something past stubbornness. Not pride, not ritual for its own sake, but something closer to loyalty. Not to a ruler, not to survival, but to the breath, to the page, to the silence between chants, to the unseen thread that tied the living to the dead, the present to the past. They didn't know if peace would ever return, but they knew the bell had once rung in peace, and they held on to that, not as a dream, as a memory, a fact, something real they had once touched with their own hands, not for hope, for honor, for rhythm, for what was once sacred, for those who could no longer bow, and maybe still was, even now, even here, especially here. They didn't call it trauma. There was no word for what happened inside you when you survived too much, when you buried too many, when you woke every night to sounds that weren't there and flinched at the wind because it reminded you of screaming. They didn't have names for those things. They just kept going. Grief wasn't talked about. Fear wasn't shared. Pain simply became a part of the day, like hunger, like weather, like winter. Monks weren't immune to it. They just had fewer places to put it. No wife to confide in. No children to cry in front of. No sword to swing. Just the sound of breath in a cold room and the weight of a world that had not yet stopped breaking. In the quiet hours before sunrise, some would sit in meditation and find nothing but noise. Screams, fire, the snapping of beams, the face of a friend who didn't make it, a prayer interrupted by blood. And they'd sit with it, not because they wanted to, but because there was nowhere else for it to go. You don't run from your own breath, even when it brings with it every memory you wish you could bury. The bell would sound, and they would flinch. A crow would caw, and a hand would clench around empty air. Some monks couldn't speak anymore. Their voices simply stopped working, retreating into silence like a wounded animal. Others chanted too loudly, too fast, as if outrunning memory. Some walked for hours in circles until the soles of their feet split. Others dug into the earth with their bare hands, not to plant anything, but just to feel something. Some screamed during meditation, mouths open but soundless, caught in the echo of things they couldn't say. No one called it illness. It was just the body's way of remembering what the mind couldn't hold alone. They still shaved their heads, still wore the robes, still lit the incense, still bowed at the altar. But inside, many were cracked, bent, split down the middle. The war hadn't ended. It had just moved inside them. It crawled under their ribs, curled up behind their eyes. The chanting halls echoed differently now, not with unity, but with strain, with effort, with voices trembling between syllables, with silence that lasted just a little too long. The pauses weren't for breath. They were for memory, and no one knew how to fix it. There were no doctors for this kind of thing, no treatments, no words. Just breathe. Just the next bow. Just the next stroke of a brush. The rituals weren't solutions. They were lifelines. They tethered the monks to something older, something unbroken, even if they themselves were. They whispered sutras not for salvation, but for structure. Because when everything else was shattered, structure could still hold. That's why the rituals mattered so much. Not because they healed, but because they held. Because even a cracked pot can carry water. Because a broken voice can still recite a verse. Because kneeling in the ashes was still a form of prayer. Each movement said, "I am still here." Each chant meant, "I remember." Each breath was a refusal to vanish. Each copied line was a rope thrown into the void. Each bow was a surrender not to despair, but to discipline. They didn't call it trauma, but they carried it. In their bodies, in their silence, in their aching legs and swollen fingers. In the pages, they copied and recopied until the ink ran out. In the spaces between footsteps, in the way they avoided mirrors, in the way they folded their robes so precisely, as if the right crease could keep the pain in place. Every day, without relief, but not without purpose. The war didn't just take lives, it bent time. Seasons blurred together, monks lost track of years. Some couldn't remember the last cherry blossom they saw, others forgot their own age. Time, once measured by bells and chants, now moved according to hunger and fear. If you had food, it was day. If you didn't, it was night. There was no grand calendar hanging in the hall. No one marked the full moons. The harvest festivals stopped. The quiet celebrations that once signaled transitions, spring rice planting, summer lanterns, winter sutra recitations, faded out. No time for ceremony. No energy for joy. But even without celebration, the monks still observed. They noticed how the wind changed when autumn approached, how the light shifted across the floorboards as days grew shorter, how frost arrived earlier now, creeping into the temple like a slow, silent guest. The body remembered what the mind tried to forget. Bones ached before the rains, skin dried with the cold. Their hands, once calloused from farming, now shook slightly from age and malnutrition. Some monks began keeping private records again, not on scrolls, on scraps of bark, on stones, scratched into wood panels hidden under floorboards, not dates, events. A brother fell sick. A raid passed by. Rice was found. Fire in the north. A storm shattered the garden wall. The ink was gone, but the memory had to go somewhere. One monk carved a single line into the back of a wooden bowl each time a season changed. After a while, he stopped counting. The lines told him nothing he didn't already feel in his body. This was time now. Not in minutes, not in months, but in small losses, in silent rituals, in the way survival reshaped the hours. And still, the monks sat. And still, they bowed. And still they waited for nothing but lived like it might arrive. They were still monks, even in the ruins, even when the walls were half collapsed and the roof let in rain, even when the rice was gone and the ink had dried up, even when the chanting halls echoed only with wind and memory. They didn't stop being monks. They couldn't, not because of duty, but because there was nothing else left. The world had stripped everything away, and all that remained was the rhythm of their practice, the only thing war hadn't stolen. The practice had become skeletal, stripped down, bare and bone deep, a kind of monasticism forged by fire and famine. Bowing not because tradition demanded it, but because the spine remembered how. Chanting not for an audience, but for air. Meditating not to reach enlightenment, but to survive the next hour without being crushed by the weight of it all. It wasn't elegant anymore. It was ragged and tired and raw. There were days when no one spoke, not out of vow, but out of exhaustion. The silence wasn't sacred. It was simply what remained, a kind of quiet that felt heavier than noise, the kind that pressed into your chest. Some monks forgot the days of the week. Others stopped marking the calendar at all. Time no longer moved in weeks or seasons. It moved from fire to frost, hunger to hunger. Sunrise, sweep. Sunset, sit. That was enough. They repurposed everything. Bits of broken statues became doorstops. Robes were turned into blankets. Broken brushes were lashed together to form one that almost worked. Metal roof tiles were hammered into makeshift cooking plates. Cracked bowls were patched with resin and clay. Nothing was wasted. Even the ashes from the hearth were used to scrub the floor, a floor that hardly anyone saw anymore. The temple was no longer a place people came to. It was a shell, a memory of what once stood. They carried on, not because they believed someone would come, but because the practice required no witness. They were caretakers of something invisible. Each sweep of the broom, each whisper of a verse was a thread holding the world together, even if only within a single courtyard. Pilgrims didn't come. The roads weren't safe. The gates stayed shut. But still, they prepared tea. Still, they swept the path. Still, they laid out a cushion for a guest who never arrived. Dust gathered, seasons changed, the trees leaned farther into the wind. And still, the cushion was set in place. A bowl was filled. A small flame was lit. Because it wasn't about who was watching. It was about the doing. Faith not as belief, but as motion. No glory, no witness. Just monks in ruins, practicing without end, without reward, without an audience. Just the stubborn continuity of breath and bow and brush. Just the quiet defiance of repetition. Because that was the only thing that hadn't been taken. Because sometimes the smallest acts are the most enduring. Because even in ashes they remembered the form of devotion. Because in a world that forgets, they were choosing to remember. Every day, every hour, with nothing but hands, breath, and silence. Sometimes the worst part wasn't what you saw. It was what you had to pretend not to see. When soldiers came to the gates, monks bowed low and kept their eyes on the ground, not out of reverence, but strategy. Eye contact invited questions. Questions led to searches. Searches led to discoveries of stored rice, of hidden manuscripts, of people sheltering behind the altar. A wrong glance could bring suspicion. A pause too long could bring ruin. So, they learned to become invisible in plain sight. They kept their hands folded, their movements small, their answers short. The robes helped, a uniform of humility, a kind of camouflage that said, "I am not a threat." They moved like shadows. They spoke like breath. Even their daily rituals were adjusted. Chants shortened, bows muted, footsteps softened. The temple, once alive with gentle noise, became a hushed space of calculated silence. But they were always afraid. Afraid of the wrong question. Afraid of the wrong gesture. Afraid that even a peaceful glance might be mistaken for defiance. Sometimes a soldier would demand suck, and when given tea instead, he'd take offense. Sometimes the mere act of standing upright was seen as disrespect. A monk once bowed too slowly and was struck. Another was silent too long and was dragged away. So fear became a muscle, always tensed, always ready. So monks learned how to break themselves into smaller pieces, how to breathe without being noticed, how to let their presence shrink into the corners of a room. One monk said he practiced walking so lightly his feet barely kissed the floor. Another whispered the sutras in a voice only he could hear. Some stopped chanting altogether and instead traced each syllable in the air with a finger hidden in their sleeves. They had to watch when the soldiers ate their food. They had to watch when they shattered statues. They had to bow while relics were stolen. And they had to pretend it didn't hurt. Not a wince. Not a breath too sharp. Even grief had to be hidden, folded away like old parchment. Because showing grief could be dangerous. Showing anything could be dangerous. Pain was a luxury. Anger, a death sentence. So they wore the face of still water. Nothing rippled. Nothing stirred. Still, when the soldiers left, they didn't scream. They didn't shout. They swept the floors. They lit incense. They repaired what they could. Broken steps were patched with spare wood. Cracks in walls were sealed with mud. Altars were cleaned with silent care. And in those quiet moments afterward, when the temple was damaged but still standing, they allowed themselves one breath that wasn't fear. Just one. A breath that carried weight and memory and silence. Then they got back to work. Because survival wasn't just about hiding. It was about holding something sacred inside you and never letting it break, no matter what. They had no clocks. Time was kept by the sun, by the sound of birds, by the changing tone of the wind as it moved through the trees. But during war, even that sense of rhythm broke. Days blurred, nights stretched. What mattered wasn't the hour, but the next moment of silence. The passage of time became something you felt in your bones, rather than measured with your eyes. Cold mornings that lingered too long, hunger that returned quicker than before, the slow crumble of walls, of certainty, of memory. The monks marked time in other ways, by how many candles remained, by how much rice was left in the jar, by how many bowls were set out at meals, and how many were quietly put back, by the wear on a robe's hem, by the number of birds returning to a bare tree, by the weight of ash brushed from the floor. Some days, the only sound in the temple was sweeping. The broom moved slow, deliberate, a whisper on stone. It didn't matter that the courtyard was covered in ash, or that the floor had cracks too deep to clean. Sweeping wasn't for tidiness. It was a ritual, a practice of presence, of care. Even if the world was falling apart, you could still brush one corner of it into order. You could still say with each motion, "I will not abandon this." They swept after attacks, after funerals, after nights with no sleep. They swept after snowfall, after birds scattered from branches in panic, after news came that another temple had fallen. The act didn't change anything, but it gave them something to hold. A broom was not a weapon. It was not a prayer, but it was something you could move, something you could control when nothing else made sense. They swept where the blood had dried. They swept over scorch marks. They swept broken tiles into piles and left them stacked like offerings to whatever might be listening. Their hands blistered, their backs ached, but they did not stop. The motion became a kind of rhythm, a heartbeat, made of bristles and dust. No one was praised for sweeping. No one complained about it either. It was what you did, what you always did. It was how you said, "I'm still here, still upright, still breathing. The floor may crack beneath me, but I will sweep it just the same. I will not let the sacred vanish quietly." A monk could be starving, shivering, unsure if the roof would hold another storm. But if he had a broom, he swept. If the broom broke, he tied it back together. If the handle snapped, he carved a new one. If there was no broom, he used his hands. Because the world doesn't stop being sacred just because it hurts. And because sometimes all you can do is keep one small place clean while everything else burns. To sweep is not to give up. It is to persist without asking for reward. It is to remain gentle when the world has gone hard. And in that softness, there is something unshakable. Even if no one sees it, even if no one remembers, you sweep and you stay. It didn't matter how long the war lasted. Some rituals refused to die. Not because they were needed. Not because they were useful, but because they were the last thing that felt real. There was one monk who still swept the stone path leading to the temple gate. Every morning, even if no one had walked it in months, even if half the stones were missing, shattered, overgrown, he would rise before the sun, take his battered straw broom, and begin at the same spot, just like he always had. He'd pause only to cough or stretch the stiffness from his back, then return to the motion. Forward, back, forward again. It wasn't about cleanliness. It was about continuity. Other monks watched but said nothing. They understood. It wasn't about cleaning. It wasn't about discipline. It was about holding a line no one else could see, a quiet resistance against the unraveling of the world, a gesture so small it looked like nothing but meant everything. To sweep meant the day still had structure, the gate still had meaning, the path still existed, even if no one was coming. The sweeping made a sound, a soft rasp, a rhythm, something human, something alive. In a world now full of silence or screaming, it was something else entirely, a reminder that someone still remembered how to be steady. The sound whispered across the courtyard, a heartbeat made of straw and stone. Some mornings it was the only sound anyone heard. Another monk still tended to the garden, though nothing had grown there in years. The soil was poor. The seeds were old, but he knelt anyway, pulled weeds, turned the earth, watered the ground with what little was left in the rain barrel. When asked why, he only said, "The earth still listens." And when no one asked, he kept doing it anyway. His hands were cracked, his knees were calloused. He worked slowly, methodically, as if coaxing the land to remember what life felt like. He planted things that would never bloom, herbs whose names only he still remembered, roots that once soothed fevers, stalks that never sprouted. But it wasn't about the harvest. It was about the tending, the ritual of attention, the prayer and repetition, as if care itself might soften the earth again one day. One of the elders kept repairing the temple roof, alone, replacing broken tiles with flat stones, hammering cracked beams with salvaged nails and quiet grunts. The roof leaked anyway, but it dripped a little less each week. He had no tools except what he could scavenge: a rusted hammer, twine, splintered wood from broken walls. Still he climbed. Still, He patched. His hands trembled, but his focus didn't. He worked until the light faded. Then he came down, lit the final candle, and sat with the others. And each night, the last candle was lit. No matter how little wax remained, no matter how dark the room, one flame, one moment of light, just enough to chant by, just enough to see the faces of those still sitting. Sometimes the flame guttered. Sometimes it burned out. Mid-prayer. But they chanted anyway. These weren't grand acts. These weren't declarations. They were threads. Threads pulled through war, through memory, through loss, through breath, through hunger, through grief, through the silence after a name is no longer spoken. No one wrote them down. No one bowed in thanks. But they continued. Because not everything was meant to be useful. Some things were just meant to be done. Because you said you would. Because that's what it meant to keep going. Because that's what it meant to be alive when everything else had stopped moving. Because the practice was the promise. Even when no one else remembered it but you. When food ran out, they didn't beg. They searched, quietly, systematically, through forest paths and frozen streams, through abandoned villages where wind moved through empty doorways and ash clung to the walls. They lifted floorboards, dug shallow pits, followed old trails hoping to find wild roots, mushrooms, anything that hadn't already been stripped away by soldiers, animals, or time. They watched birds, tracked animal scat, studied the grooves in tree bark to see what deer or badgers might have left behind. Anything edible, anything vaguely nourishing, was considered. A monk learned to identify everything. What could be eaten raw, what needed boiling, what killed slowly, what killed fast. Hunger made you wise and slow. You didn't rush when your legs were weak. You didn't panic when your stomach twisted. You just breathed. You moved with the patience of a stone. You paid attention. Hunger sharpened every sense. You began to hear where roots grew, to smell where water might be trapped under snow. They dried pine needles to stretch rice, ground acorns into powder, boiled bark, crushed insects, ate moss scraped from rocks. They boiled water even when it was already clean, because the ritual mattered more than the risk. A bowl of broth was still a ceremony, still an offering, still something sacred. The act of eating was deliberate, slow. Each mouthful was acknowledged. Each sip of tea, even bitter and weak, was accepted like a blessing. They shared everything. One bowl passed hand to hand, one strip of dried yam cut 10 ways, a pinch of salt rubbed between fingers and pressed to a tongue. They never ate alone. If one monk went without, so did the others. That was the rule. That was the vow. It was unspoken, but absolute. When someone found something, an old radish under frost, a handful of chestnuts, it belonged to everyone. Joy was measured by how thinly you could stretch the meal. When the stores were truly gone, they fasted, not as an act of discipline, but as a matter of math. One day without food was one more day someone else might live. Their bodies shrank. Their skin thinned. Their eyes grew hollow. But the bell still rang. The floor was still swept. The sutras were still recited, even if only in a whisper. The rituals did not waver. Not because the monks were stronger than others, but because they had built their lives on repetition. Repetition gave them something to hold on to, even as their bodies betrayed them. Sometimes they dreamed of food. Not feasts, just steamed rice, pickled vegetables, miso soup, warm in the chest. They'd wake with tears in their eyes and taste nothing but saliva. But they would rise, light incense, sit, breathe, bow. That was the practice. Hunger didn't interrupt it. Hunger became part of it. Hunger became part of the practice. The ache was not a punishment. It was a reminder. You are still here. You are still breathing. Even now, even like this, even without strength, you can still sit upright. Even with nothing left, you can still offer silence. And that was enough. Not because it cured the hunger, but because it made space for something larger than it. Most monks didn't die in battle. They died from infection, from cold, from starvation, from accidents in the forest, or quiet slips down ravines. They were taken by the small things: fevers, infected cuts, the wrong mushroom mistaken for medicine, or they simply disappeared, swallowed by the mountains, the road, or the silence. Some were taken by sickness that arrived with travelers, others by hunger that didn't knock. Most went quietly. There was rarely screaming, only stillness. One day they were there, sweeping the stones. The next, the broom leaned against the wall with no hand to claim it. There were no grave markers, no final words etched in stone. Just absences. A robe left folded on a mat, a bowl untouched at mealtime, a prayer bead strand left unfinished, a name no longer chanted during morning recitation. Just space where a body used to be, and more sweeping to do. The empty spaces grew familiar. They became part of the monastery's shape. Sometimes the others knew. A monk went out for water and never came back, or went to trade herbs in a village and was caught between soldiers, or gave the last of his rice to someone else and faded quietly the next morning. Other times, there was no explanation at all. They just weren't there anymore, and nobody asked questions out loud. The question was always the same. The answer always silence. Speculation was a luxury they couldn't afford. So they folded the robe, stored the bowl, and went on. There were no funerals. There wasn't enough to bury, and there wasn't time. Death didn't stop the routine. The garden still needed tending. The floor still needed sweeping. The sutras still had to be recited. The shoes still had to be lined up neatly at the threshold, even if the voice that once joined the chorus had gone quiet. Even if there was one less pair. The chores were the mourning, the rhythm, the eulogy. But monks found ways to remember. A candle burned longer that night, a line of calligraphy written slower, more carefully, a bell rung one extra time. Not tradition, just memory, just a way of holding the person without clinging. Just a breath held a second longer. Some tied a knot into their robes. Some placed a stone on the altar for 7 nights, not to honor the dead, but to honor the continuation of the living. Some monks wrote the names in secret ledgers. Others carved initials into hidden beams beneath the floor. Some folded a robe in the person's shape and left it undisturbed for 7 days. Not because they expected those names to be remembered forever, but because someone had to write them once. Someone had to say, "You were here." Someone had to make space in the silence to acknowledge the missing. Most monks didn't expect to be remembered. They didn't live for legacy. They lived for practice, for the breath, for the stillness, for the chance to wake up, kneel, and chant again. And when their time came, they tried to go as they had lived, quietly, without fear, without grasping. They didn't cling to the past or cry for the future. They just inhaled, exhaled, and stopped, like a candle running out of wax, like snow melting back into the earth. In a world where nothing felt stable, that kind of death, unclenched, unshaken, was its own kind of miracle. No glory, no drama, just a calm exit. The way wind leaves a room, the way rain dries on stone. A moment not meant to be seen, but simply completed. They didn't need monuments, they just needed to have stayed true, even as everything else fell apart. That was enough. That was all the legacy they asked for. A breath. A name whispered once. A bowl left clean by the door. A morning that continued without them. and a practice that never stopped. The war didn't end. It faded. Not with a treaty, not with a parade, just fewer soldiers on the roads, fewer screams at night. One day the wind blew, and no ash came with it. One morning the monks woke up and no one had tried to break down the gate. That was all. No messenger came. No scroll declared peace. It simply stopped being loud. There was no announcement, just absence. And with it, the silence returned, but it wasn't the same. It was heavier now, older. It crept through the temple halls and lingered over the cracked stones. The silence didn't comfort them. It questioned them, asked what they would do now, with everything gone and everything still waiting. The monks stepped out from the shadows of their ruined halls. They looked at the world with tired eyes. Gardens had overgrown, roofs had collapsed, statues lay in pieces. Some missing heads, some blackened with fire. What was once a sanctuary had become a shell. But it was theirs. Even in ruin, the stone paths remembered their feet. The wind remembered their chants. They didn't celebrate. They didn't cry. They just started sweeping. They swept the stones, gathered broken tiles, rehung the banners that could be saved, set offerings before shattered altars, fed the birds, replanted the herbs, wrote new sutras to replace what had been burned. They removed what couldn't be salvaged, gently, with care, as if even the broken pieces deserved dignity. They did not rush. The work was slow, deliberate, sacred not because it was beautiful, but because it was done at all. Because rebuilding in silence without applause was its own form of reverence. They cleaned not to erase what had happened, but to make room for what could still grow. Some who had fled began to return. Not many, but enough. A pair of sandals left at the gate, a voice chanting in the distance, a bowl placed beside another. Slowly, the monastery breathed again, a shared glance during morning meditation, a murmured blessing over meager rice. No loud reunions, just presence, just breathe. There were fewer monks now, fewer resources, less time, but more clarity, more stillness. Not the stillness of fear, but the stillness after fire, when the ashes have settled and the ground waits. It wasn't the stillness of death. It was the stillness of readiness, of beginning again. No one spoke of rebuilding the temple to what it had been. That wasn't possible. That wasn't the point. Instead, they built something else, something smaller, quieter, but no less devoted. A stone placed with intention, a bell repaired with melted scraps, a new altar made from wood salvaged from a broken gate. They kept no records of the destruction. They did not write down the names of the battles or the dates of their losses, but they remembered, in posture, in rhythm, in the way they bowed deeper now and sat longer in the dark. Because survival wasn't the goal. The practice was, and it was still here. So they were too, and that was enough to begin again. By the end, most of the monks didn't even know what side was winning. Some didn't even know what the sides were anymore. The names changed. The banners changed. The cruelty didn't. One flag went down. Another came up. A different color, a different emblem. The same destruction. They stopped trying to follow the rumors. At a certain point, it didn't matter who was in charge. Every new ruler brought soldiers, taxes, fear. Every new promise ended in ash. The only real difference was the color of the flames. There was no news, only rumor. Messages came from travelers who hadn't eaten in days, from merchants missing half their wares, from soldiers too tired to pretend they were anything else. Each story contradicted the last. The capital had fallen. No, it had held. A new shogun was rising. No, he had been killed. Peace talks had begun. No, someone burned the envoy's house to the ground. The monks would nod, offer tea, listen politely, and forget it all by the next morning, because none of it reached them anymore. Not really. Monks listened, and then they returned to their work, because What else was there? They could not rebuild what had been destroyed. Not fully. Not in the same way. The statues were gone. The library was gone. Some of their brothers were gone too. Some had wandered off and never returned. Some had been taken. Some had simply stopped speaking. But the floor still needed sweeping. The altar still needed cleaning. The soup still needed stirring. There were still prayers to recite. There was still the sound of the bell, even if it was cracked, even if it rang strange. They planted herbs in scorched soil. They repaired the roof with mismatched tiles. They rewrote the sutras from memory, even when their hands shook. They mended their robes with thread pulled from rice sacks. They boiled water 3 times to make it taste like more. They kept their hands moving, even when their hearts were tired. Every task was a stitch in something larger, not a temple exactly, not a return to the past, but a rhythm, a breath, a structure in the middle of collapse, a vow in motion. There was power in that, not glory, not victory, but power. The kind that came from staying still when the world tried to shake you loose, from showing up again and again to do something small with care, from standing in the ruins and saying, "This matters," even if no one sees it. And maybe that's what the war couldn't kill, the ability to begin again. Not with fanfare, not with triumph, but with a broom, with a chant, with 2 hands in the dirt, not because they believed it would work, but because beginning was the vow, and the vow remained, even in the silence, even in the ashes, even when the world forgot them. The seasons didn't stop for war. Cherry blossoms still fell in spring, even if no one stood beneath them to admire their drift. Cicadas still screamed in summer, louder than any chant, echoing off the stone walls that hadn't yet collapsed. The wind still carried leaves through the temple grounds when autumn came, piling against broken steps and the corners of abandoned prayer rooms. And in winter, snow still covered the shattered tiles, softening the edges of cracked stone and splintered gates, turning destruction into something briefly beautiful. Nature didn't care who ruled, who burned, or who bowed. It didn't ask who had lost. It just kept going. For the monks who remained, the turning of the seasons was the only clock that mattered anymore. Days were counted by the length of shadow, months marked by when the persimmons ripened, or when the river froze solid. The calendar had burned with the rest of the records. No more festival days, no more temple markets, just sunrise, breath, silence, and weather. There was something steady in it, something that couldn't be taken. You couldn't steal the wind. You couldn't burn the moon. No one could interrupt the sunrise. No sword could silence the tide. And so the monks turned their attention there, back to what remained, back to what had never asked anything of them, and yet always showed up. They noticed things more now. The way mist curled through the bamboo before dawn, the sound of melting ice dripping from the eaves, the exact moment when a cicada husk splits and releases a trembling new body into the air. The way moss grew back over scorched stones, not fast, not flashy, but certain. The rhythm of the earth had become their scripture, the slow, wordless teaching that never stopped. The temple walls were gone, but the mountain remained. The clouds remained. The silence, at times unbearable, remained. Some monks began to measure their recovery this way, not by how much was rebuilt, but by how much they could notice. A bird's call, the smell of pine, the way light passed through smoke in the late afternoon, the difference between an early frost and a hard one, the color of water before it froze. The world was still damaged. So were they. But there was a kind of conversation between them now, one scarred thing speaking to another, and it wasn't healing. Not really. The monks still woke with aches they didn't speak of, still avoided certain memories, certain faces, still flinched at sudden sounds, but there was a rhythm again, a cycle, a reason to look at the sky. Some began to sweep the temple paths again, even if no one walked them. Others rebuilt a garden, not because it would survive, but because they needed to plant something. One monk began collecting stones, arranging them in circles that meant nothing but gave shape to the hours. Another wrote haiku in the dirt with a stick, letting the wind erase each line. These things didn't fix them, but they didn't need to. It was enough to keep breathing, to keep noticing, to keep showing up, not healing, but something close, something quiet, something real. There was no end-of-war announcement, no trumpet, no messenger on horseback declaring peace, just fewer fires on the horizon, just silence that stayed silent. The armies didn't leave all at once. They bled away slowly, like water from cracked stone. One day, the smoke stopped rising from the far hills. Another day, no boot prints were found near the stream. Weeks passed without a single demand, a single threat, a single cry. The monks didn't celebrate. They had nothing left to celebrate with. No wine, no drums, no clear sense of what survival even meant anymore. By then, most temples were empty, not from abandonment, but from loss. The ones who had stayed weren't the same. They moved slower. They bowed lower. Their hands trembled when they lit incense. They didn't ask if it was truly over because they no longer believed in endings. The war had stayed too long to be undone by silence. Grass grew where bodies had once fallen. Vines wrapped themselves around broken statues. The bell, if it still existed, was rung softly, more out of habit than proclamation. It didn't echo the way it used to. Sutras were recited with fewer voices, but they were recited all the same. The rhythm of the chants continued, less as a statement of faith and more as a structure to lean on. Meals were taken in silence. Candles were lit, not in hope, but in memory. Each flame flickered in recognition of someone no longer there. Some monks returned to what was left of their old homes. Wooden beams blackened, statues faceless, gardens swallowed by weeds and thorn. They rebuilt, not because they believed it would last, but because rebuilding was part of the practice. Hammer, nail, brush, chant. The rhythm mattered, not the result. They dug into the cold ground with stiff fingers. They carried broken roof tiles one by one. They planted herbs where they used to grow, even if the soil had changed. And in time, a few visitors returned. A starving farmer with nothing to offer but silence. A child with no family, eyes wide with too much history. A soldier who had forgotten how to be anything else. Armor gone, but posture still rigid. The monks gave them rice, water, space. Not as charity, as continuity. Because the teachings weren't stored in books or walls. They were in the act of giving, in the choice to stay, in the breath between ruin and rebuilding, in the gentle reminder that healing doesn't ask permission. It begins in the middle of doing. Evenings grew longer. Lanterns were relit. A small fire was kept for warmth, and its smoke rose steadily into the sky, not as a signal, but as a sign that something still lived there. The silence, once oppressive, softened into something else, stillness, a kind of peace, but not the kind that comes from treaties, the kind that comes from refusing to leave. They didn't ask for peace. They just kept making it, one day at a time. One bowl of rice, one line of scripture, one stone swept clean. They never saw victory, no banners, no parades, no great announcement that the war was over. For the monks who survived, peace didn't come with a trumpet. It came slowly, unevenly, like mist rising from wet earth. One day, the soldiers didn't come back. Another day, the smoke on the horizon didn't appear. A week passed without anyone trying to take their rice. The silence didn't feel like peace. Not at first. It felt like waiting for the next strike that never came. Like holding your breath through a long winter and not knowing if spring would ever arrive. And still, they waited. The monks didn't believe in peace the way others did. Not anymore. They believed in breath, in returning, in watching the world carefully before deciding it was safe to speak, safe to stand tall, safe to unbar the gate. They had learned that peace could vanish faster than it arrived, so they treated it like a guest who might leave at any moment. They moved slowly, deliberately, unwilling to trust in calm until they had watched it last more than a few days. It was months before some dared to ring the bell again, the same bell that had been wrapped in cloth, silenced for years. The sound startled birds from the trees, echoed through the empty hills. There was no answer, just silence, thick and wide. But still they rang it again the next morning, then again the morning after that. Slowly, rhythm returned. Not like before, never like before, but in small, careful echoes. Enough to remind them who they were. They swept the grounds, rebuilt the walls, a handful of stones at a time, gathered broken statues and set them upright. Even the ones missing heads, especially the ones missing heads. They patched the roof. They cleaned the soot off the altars. They planted new trees beside the ones that had died. They restored the old water basin, even though it leaked. They wrote fresh prayers on slips of paper and hung them on wind-worn branches. They copied new scrolls from memory, sometimes arguing gently over a forgotten line before settling on what felt true. When memory failed, they guessed, not carelessly, but with reverence. They believed the truth would find its way through intent, even if the words weren't perfect. The practice wasn't about accuracy. It was about showing up. They didn't do it because anyone told them to. They did it because the practice was still there, buried under ash, cracked in half, but still breathing. It had never been about the buildings. It had always been about attention, about care, about doing something well, even when no one else was looking, especially then. Restoration wasn't about returning to what was. It was about honoring what remained. Sometimes travelers came through, scarred, thin, silent. The monks fed them, gave them water, said little. No sermons, just tea, just warmth, a blanket, a nod, a space by the fire. Some stayed a night, some stayed a season. Some never left. They didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. The ones who arrived carried silence the same way the monks did, heavily, carefully. In time, laughter returned, not all at once, and never loudly. It came in small bursts, a shared joke over a crooked beam, a chuckle at an uneven bowl, a smile when a new robe stitched from scraps actually fit. No one tried to reclaim what had been lost. They simply learned how to live inside what was left. Peace wasn't clean, it wasn't whole. It was scattered like the temple itself, but it was enough to begin again. It didn't matter if it was perfect. It mattered that it was possible, that it could be felt in the steam of a bowl of soup, in the sound of bare feet on old wood, in the sight of two monks sweeping in unison, in the shared silence between sips of tea, in the bell rung not to mark time but to say, "We are still here." So they did. One bowl, one chant, one morning bell, one breath after another, one moment of care, one gesture of kindness, one sunrise at a time, and the world went on, softer than before, but still here, still breathing, still enough.